everybody, and welcome to not Arizona. I am currently standing here on Madawaska Lake, just a few miles north of Caribou, Maine. And it is currently in the high 20s and snowing. There's blowing snow on the lake behind me, and that is absolutely perfect because we are out here in Aroostook County, Maine, which is the northernmost county in the state, to spend the next 5 or so days driving around, snowmobiling around, and seeing what we can find. It should be a lot of fun, something that we don't often get to experience in Arizona, so we are coming up here to Maine to test out the ultimate winter driving machine, the snowmobile. It was 18 degrees with a strong wind when I landed at Logan International in Boston. I met up with my cousin Bill, who makes it out to Arizona about once a year and has done some big trips with us in the past. It was late in the day already, and we still had to get our riding gear ready. We'd be leaving Massachusetts and heading for Maine tomorrow. Because it was so late in the season, nearly springtime by the time I made it out, the trailer, fully loaded with 5 snowmobiles, or sleds as they're called, was already parked at Bill's camp in central Maine near Milo. It was about noon on Sunday when we, Bill, my new friend PJ, and I all hit the road bound for Maine. After a couple of hours, we quickly crossed through New Hampshire and then over the iconic bridge into Maine. Welcome to Maine, open for business. Even though we had already covered nearly 150 miles, we were only about halfway to our camp for the night. We proceeded northeast. After another hour, we turned off Highway 95 and began taking back roads the rest of the way to camp. By the time we rolled into Orrinville Township, which is just south of Milo, it was already nearly sunset. The high that day was in the low 20s, so the less time we could spend outside, the better. With our excitement finally kicking in, we pulled up to the black trailer loaded with snowmobiles and got out. We immediately set to work, opening up the trailer, starting up the sleds, and backing them out. We would be staying only one night at Bill's rustic cabin just 3/4 of a mile from here, since the snow here was thin and slippery, which meant not good conditions for riding. We loaded up whatever gear we needed for the night, put the generator onto the toboggan, and set out for camp. Although it was less than a mile ride, the freezing air was numbing. As we pulled up to the cabin, we left our sleds running as we unloaded our gear into the dark, cold cabin. The first goal was to get the generator running so that we would have light. Then we immediately set to work getting the wood stove cranking. Because it was literally freezing inside the cabin, we decided to head back to the truck and into the town of Milo for some nice warm pizza and cold beer. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was almost 10 p.m., but the cabin was nice and toasty. The next morning, we woke up and got some French toast cooking on the propane stove. Today, we'd be hauling the trailer and sleds even further north where the riding conditions were better. We quickly packed up our gear and started up the sleds. It was just a short ride back to the trailer, where we loaded up the sleds, attached the trailer, and hit the road. Using back roads, we connected back with Highway 95, which we would be following all the way to the Canadian border. We were treated to some excellent views of Mount Katahdin, which is Maine's highest point, as we climbed through ever-remote country. After a solid 2-hour drive, we reached Houlton, Maine, and split off onto Highway 1 and followed it northbound. We cruised through the towns of Mars Hill and Presque Isle. The further north we got, the deeper the snow was. Roughly 2 hours past Houlton, we reached our destination for the next 3 nights. We'd be staying at a rented cabin on the banks of the very frozen Madawaska Lake. Although the cabin was technically in New Sweden, Maine, we were just 20 miles north of the town of Caribou. This cabin would provide a prime location for great riding throughout Aroostook County, the largest and most remote county in Maine. Battling some icy roads, we finally got the trailer staged and the sleds unloaded. We tossed our gear into the pre-warmed cabin, It was only about 2 o'clock and we were anxious to get some riding done today. After a quick consultation of the snowmobile map, we decided we'd head for Caribou to see how the riding was. Maine has an interconnected trail system, ITS for short, that includes several long regional trails as well as many smaller local trails. Basically, you can ride nearly anywhere across the state provided the conditions are right. We left Madawaska Lake and connected with ITS 83. Heading south, it was clear to see that the trails were in great shape. With about a foot of base and nice wide tracks to follow, we were able to cruise at a solid 45 miles an hour. After crossing several old bridges and desolate highways, we reached Caribou 20 miles later. It was around dinner time, so we decided to grab some food, and after some tricky navigating, snowmobiles do not turn well on asphalt, we were able to park and walk the rest of the way to dinner. After we topped off our food tanks, it was time to begin the ride back to the cabin. We made a quick detour on the way back to top off the snowmobile tanks. Being two-strokes, snowmobiles get pretty bad gas mileage, and because we'd be having a longer day tomorrow, we'd figure we could fill up now and save some time in the morning. By 7 p.m. the sun was down. Today was just as cold as yesterday, low 20s for a high, with wind. We made it back to the cabin by about 8, having put about 50 miles on the sleds today. Since the night was still young, we walked out onto the frozen lake. The silence was broken by the sound of cracking ice. Cracking ice from the freezing, not melting, however. It was unsettling nevertheless, and eventually we retreated back into the warm cabin for the night. The next day began like the others had, with a quick breakfast and getting dressed up in all of our snow gear. Today, the weather would continue to be cold, but with the storm coming through, there was a chance of snow later today with rain and warmer temperatures tomorrow. It was gray and gloomy when we locked up the cabin and got the sled started. They spluttered to life and spewed smoke as they warmed up. We rode down the road and back to our connection on ITS 83. We continued south back to the Caribou Junction. Today, we were heading for Limestone, Maine in the abandoned Loring Air Force Base. We have visited the base before, but it remains one of our favorite destinations in northeast Maine. After 20 miles of riding, we passed through Caribou and proceeded on to ITS 90. After another 10 miles, we had reached the tiny town of Limestone. Limestone is just a couple miles away from the Canadian border of New Brunswick. We quickly passed through town and rode around the outskirts, branching off the main ITS trail. We took a side road up to an abandoned access road. Within minutes, we had rode over a snowbank and were on the runway of Loring Air Force Base. Loring was active from 1953 to 1990. For geographical reasons, this is the closest point in the United States to Europe and was an important airbase used as part of the Strategic Air Command. At one time, the base housed an entire city and accommodated planes like the B-36 and the B-52, as well as several fighter wings and fuel tankers. The runway here is 2.5 miles long. We found ourselves riding northbound on the wide, flat runway that was now covered in about a foot of snow. We pegged the throttle and held on tight for the bumpy ride. Snow drifts had blown across the runway, and the now strong winds meant that we couldn't go flat out. After reaching the end of the main runway, we stopped to look at the remaining landing lights and markers that line the runway. Even though the base has been abandoned for over 20 years, it still remains fairly intact and well preserved today, thanks to the newly developed Loring Commerce Center. We proceeded back towards the control tower and main hangar for further investigation. The tall control tower remains, watching over an empty airfield. The faded lettering on the side of the building states that we were now at 700 feet above sea level. The building is locked up tight so we could only observe from the outside. Either way, the weather was deteriorating fast and it had begun to blow snow. We huddled under a small awning to discuss our plans. Before leaving the base, we rode around the two extraordinarily large hangars that remain on the west side of the base. The smaller of the two features an arching door that is purported to hold 2 to 3 massive B-52s. A quick peep in the glass windows revealed a mostly empty hangar, except for a few old vehicles stored inside. The larger hangar to the south was even more impressive. This one was able to hold 6 B-52s. The sliding doors towered over us and our seemingly puny snowmobiles. A look inside a broken window revealed an eerily empty building. The crappy weather meant that we had to keep moving. For the second year in a row, weather cut our exploration short at Loring. Hopefully we would have time to come back and explore a little more. We rode the sleds off the base and within a mile or so found a pair of abandoned buildings. These ones were unlocked, and in order to get out of the now heavy snow, we ventured inside. The scattered trash and 2 inches of solid ice on the floor showed that this place hadn't been used in a long time. Several large garage doors and tons of fire equipment gave us clues to the purpose of these buildings. It seemed like they were used as some sort of truck maintenance and fire station, used to keep vehicles running when the base was active. After poking around for maybe half an hour in the creepy, heavily graffitied buildings, we continued back onto ITS 80 and then onto ITS 90 as we began to make our way back. At a quick stop for gas, we realized something was wrong with one of the sleds. The left front ski on Bill's sled was throwing a huge amount of snow. We lifted it up to find that the skag, or the metal tube in the middle of the ski, which is used for steering, was completely sheared off. It wasn't a huge deal since we had a spare one back at the cabin in New Sweden. We continued all the way back to the cabin in the heavy snow. The fresh powder provided a nice layer on top of the existing snowmobile trail, but was sticking to the windshields, our visor, and jackets. Back at the cabin, we watched the blowing snow on Madawaska Lake and took advantage of some downtime to repair the broken skag on Bill's sled. With conditions getting worse still, we opted for a truck ride to dinner that night instead of sleds. We enjoyed some great seafood and, more importantly, poutine at the nearby Lakeview restaurant. Today had been a solid day of riding despite the deteriorating weather. We managed to put on about 95 miles and had seen some pretty darn cool places. Sitting around in the cabin, we checked the weather and talked about our plans for tomorrow. It was supposed to be warm with the possibility of rain all day. We went to bed not knowing what exactly we'd be doing tomorrow. Next time, we continue our snowmobile adventure as we get into the far reaches of northeasternmost Maine. We'll visit Fort Kent, the scenic Allagash River, and snowmobile down the actual US-Canada border before getting back to Loring Air Force Base to do some more exploring. All that and more fun as we finish up Maine.